Welcome, everybody, to the December virtual discussion held by the American Philosophical Society's Library and Museum. I'm thrilled to host a conversation today about the Somerset case. But before we get to the heart of the matter and the reason why I know all of you are zooming in, I want to make a few just general announcements about some things that are going to be happening at the Society in the next few weeks that may be of interest to folks. First, on December the 12th, the Society is hosting the Susan Montgomery Lecture here in Franklin Hall in Philadelphia. So if you are in Philadelphia or the region and want to attend, you can come to Franklin Hall. Information is on our website on that. We will also be live streaming the event. And that event will be a concert featuring Curtis Institute faculty members performing and then in conversation with each other about the work that they do. On December the 13th, we're hosting our December virtual discussion, and that one is going to be on climate science, and it's inspired by our current museum exhibition, Becoming Weatherwise: A History of Climate Science in North America. And then on January the 12th, after the holidays, I'm thrilled to announce the Society's first international exchange since the COVID pandemic occurred. On January the 12th, we're going to be hosting Ewan Morris, who's going to be talking about electrifying thinkers. And he's going to be focusing on Richard Price, who was an elected member of both the American Philosophical Society and the Learned Society of Wales. This is inspired by both Richard Price's 300th birthday and Benjamin Franklin's birthday, which happens on January the 13th every year here at the Society. That lecture will be in person in Franklin Hall, but also streamed live online. And we're excited to host the Academy of Wales, the Learned Society of Wales, here in January. And then in February, the Society is going to be hosting its own lecture in Wales as part of this exchange. So I encourage you all to check out our events online. These are just a few of them that are happening, but if you check out our website, you can see all the events the Society is going to be hosting in the coming weeks. And I look forward to seeing everybody on Zoom or in person. So today we are very excited, and I personally have been very anxious to see this conversation about the Somerset case. And I know that some of those who have zoomed in are probably very familiar with the case, but I know a lot of others have zoomed in because they've never heard of the Somerset case. And I have to admit some of my own ignorance about the case. And one of the reasons we wanted to host this conversation among leading legal scholars and scholars of abolition and scholars of politics is to explore this case and learn more about it. So as a quick background, the Somerset case occurred in 1772 in England. And what the issue was, there was an enslaved man named James Somerset, who had been purchased in Boston by Charles Steuart. Steuart then returned to England with James Somerset. And in 1771, Somerset escaped and was later captured. Steuart decided to then sell Somerset in Jamaica, and Somerset was put on a boat and he's being prepared to be sent to Jamaica, where he'd be sold into a plantation society there in Jamaica. A group of abolitionists in England had been trying to force the question on whether or not slavery was legal or not within England and Wales in particular. And so Somerset created the opportunity for them to do that. The outcome of the case was that Lord Mansfield, who was the justice hearing the case, determined that slavery was odious to the laws of England, the Constitution, the British Constitution, and that there were, and to natural rights, natural law. And so Somerset was essentially emancipated. And many people point to this case as being fundamental in the history of abolition. Others have questioned it and its importance and its significance. And one of the questions that really is outstanding is that occurring as it did in 1772, right on the cusp of the American Revolution, what, if any, effect did it have on the American Revolution itself or the history of abolition in the United States? And so today we've organized a fantastic lineup of scholars who are going to talk about the Somerset case, talk about its significance or its insignificance, and talk about why it mattered, and to whom it may have mattered. And so what I'd like to do now is introduce all of our panelists. I also want to encourage our audience to ask questions as they come to them. There's a Q&A function on the bottom of the Zoom panel. We are going to take questions throughout the conversation, and after about 30 or 40 minutes, turn it over to these audience questions, but ask them whenever they come to mind. So moderating our conversation today is David Waldstreicher. Professor Waldstreicher is at CUNY University in New York City. He's the author of 3 books and numerous articles and essays and reviews. His most notable books for the conversation today is a study of Benjamin Franklin and slavery that I encourage everybody to check out if they want to learn more about that topic, and a book called Slavery's Constitution. We've also asked Holly Brewer, who's a professor at the University of Maryland, an author of Birth or Consent, and most recently an article creating a common law of slavery, which received the Sutherland Prize by the American Legal History Society. She's currently working on a book on the origins of American slavery, one that also confronts the relationship of slavery to the American Revolution. We also have Christopher Brown, who's a professor at Columbia and specializes in the British Empire and abolition and slavery within the empire itself, especially the 17th and 18th century. He's the author of Moral Capital, Foundations of British Abolitionism. We've also invited Manisha Sinha, who's a professor at the University of Connecticut and is a scholar of abolition in the long 19th century. So we have Chris in the 17th and 18th century and Professor Sinha in the long 19th century. She's the author of many articles and reviews and books. Most recently, The Slave's Cause, A History of Abolition, which if I read all the prizes that were awarded, we would not have any time for conversations. We've also invited Alan Taylor, a 2-time Pulitzer Prize winner and a member of the American Philosophical Society, the author of numerous books, but I would like to point out 2 in particular: The Internal Enemy, Slavery and War in Virginia, which received the Pulitzer Prize, and a trilogy that is a study of early American history, a 1 volume on the colonial experience, 1 on the Revolution, and a 3rd on the Republic, which also confronts the history of slavery in a number of different ways. So welcome, everybody. Thank you for taking the time. I am so excited to hear this conversation. And with that, I want to turn things over to David.
Thank you, Patrick. And thank you for the concise introduction to what I'm sure will strike all listeners already as something of an interpretive conundrum in both British and American history. Having followed the historiography on the Somerset case for some time, because it was a topic that my mentor, David Bryan Davis, wrote about so compellingly more than 40 years ago in The Problem of Slavery in the Age of Revolution, I've been quite struck by how the more interest and excitement we see about the Somerset case coming from different varieties of historians, and the more it seems to be cropping up in textbooks and in popular media and even in movies like the movie Bell from some years ago, the greater disparity we see in different interpretations of it, as Patrick alluded to, some saying that it was a revolutionary event and others suggesting that it was an insignificant one, and those responses also varying depending on what location, geographical, and but also what perspective in the history of in the history of slavery or of anti-slavery, the history of the American Revolution. So it's a particular pleasure to have this panel of experts who are both whose own work has both been deeply focused on these questions, but also synthetic in nature. So I'm very excited for this conversation. So I thought it would be best to start with asking, since the importance of Somerset is contested, what each of you think is the most important thing or things that people should know about Somerset v. Steuart as an event in history.
Do you have a sequence in mind, David? Maybe Manisha should go first.
Oh, I was going to defer to you, Alan, but thank you. I've been thinking about this actually quite a bit recently, and I wanted to, of course, thank Patrick and the APS for hosting us, and Patrick for the kind introduction. But David, I think your question, alluded to the fact that there has been this amazing historical literature on the Somerset case that has really passed out the decision, the legal history, and shown us how, that has shown us quite clearly that the decision really curtailed certain slaveholding prerogatives in Britain, did not necessarily abolish slavery. And there's, of course, a controversy over its significance or lack thereof in Britain and its colonies. But as a historian of abolition, there are two things that I would really want people to be aware of. And some things that we don't normally think about in the context of Somerset, surprisingly. And one is the Black resistance to slavery and this tradition of freedom suits that goes back to 17th century Virginia. My late friend and colleague Thea Hunter talked about how Somerset spurred freedom suits in Revolutionary America, but actually Somerset himself might have been influenced by this tradition of contesting for your freedom. So this is an important aspect of Black abolitionism, suing for your freedom. And what we know about Somerset now shows us that, these people sought out anti-slavery allies. So it's not just a story of these abolitionist lawyers. It's also a story of Black people making freedom claims and developing a popular legal culture and using the law as an instrument of liberation. So that's one of the things I always tell my students, that one of the most important decisions in Anglo-American anti-slavery jurisprudence bears the name of a runaway slave. And that's fitting. It's not a coincidence. And of course, there is a tradition even amongst Afro-British people, as we know, cases preceding Somerset, Jonathan Strong, there are others, Thomas Lewis, John and Mary Hylas. There are a number of them taking place in Britain too. So it is a transatlantic story. The second important thing that I want to quickly talk about in terms of the significance of the Somerset case, and something that I think many Americans may not be aware of, is its long afterlives in the history of American abolitionism and anti-slavery politics. So abolitionist lawyers use what they call the Somerset principle or the freedom principle to establish free soil in the North. And you'll see this in cases in the 19th century, right down to Dred Scott. You see abolitionist lawyers evoking Somerset, and when the judgment is made in their favor, those judges evoke Somerset. Of course, slaveholders, and when the judgment is against them, they would evoke, the slave grace case, or even going right back to York and Talbot. But the point remains that Somerset is not a non-event in the sense that it has these long afterlives in American history. Even the tactics that Sharpe uses and that Somerset's lawyers use, evoking the protections of English common law, habeas corpus, trial by jury, these are things that abolitionist lawyers try to establish in the northern states, leading slaveholders to demand more and more draconian laws for fugitive slave rendition. So this goes on, of course, right up to the 1850s. And this spreads right up to even border slave states like Missouri, where the Dred Scott case originates. And one of his lawyers is, of course, Edward Bates, who becomes Lincoln's Attorney General. So I think many Americans are not aware of how Somerset lives on in anti-slavery jurisprudence and in American law, right up down to the Civil War. And so that's the second important thing that I really wanted people to know. I know I was told to be concise, but those are the two things that really matter to me.
Let me pick up on something Manisha said, which I think is right on the mark. I think people who want to narrow down the Somerset decision focus very much on the literal reading of the decision. And that Mansfield, my understanding is, didn't intend it to sweep away slavery in England. But what it does is it unleashes this discourse of contestation, and not just in England. So the Somerset decision takes on, over time, growing significance because people insist that it was more sweeping than in fact it initially was. And so there are many people who end up contributing to the Somerset decision who were not in that courtroom on that day. And so I think what Manisha is saying is right on the money.
And if I could just add two things, and thank you, APS, for organizing this, and David for moderating. It's great to be with my colleagues to discuss this issue. It also sort of starts a pro-slavery set of arguments in the English-speaking world that really had not been there prior to the Somerset case. I mean, I think it's really important that this is the moment where, and really the first moment where slavery seems to require an active defense, as opposed to its morality, or at least its legality, being taken for granted. And the tradition of pro-slavery writing really comes out of this case, in part because slaveholders are worried about what the consequences might be from a judgment that seems to limit the rights of slaveholders in the men and women they claim to own. The other thing I think it's worth really saying is that there's a lot of debate among historians, among us, among many scholars, about how to interpret the judgment both in its moment and afterwards. That was true 250 years ago too. There was a lot of confusion and a lot of conflict and a lot of interpretive work around how should we understand what the meaning of this case will be. So in some ways, the discussion that we have a quarter of a millennium later about how to think about this case is picking up a debate that was happening immediately after the judgment. So I think that that's worth knowing as well. It's the impact of it has always been in question one way or another.
If I could jump in on that just for a moment, Holly. It's not as well known as it should be, but we need to credit Seymour Drescher and Gretchen Holbrook-Gerzina, who wrote years ago that the Somerset case was a media event in England, that it took 6 months to get decided, and it was already being debated in the newspaper before Mansfield decided. So that this ambiguity and controversy that Chris is referring to doesn't even start with the decision. It starts before that.
That's
which
right.
I think is revealing. And
my comments actually follow straight on that. If you're coming as an outsider to this case and you're like, why would we care about a case from 50 years ago? My answer is that it's a court case that opens up in crucial ways the way that judges then as now make policy in the Anglo-American legal system. While it might not have freed all the slaves in England, and certainly not in the colonies in an immediate and practical sense, because it specifically did not apply there, it undermined the logic of chattel slavery, that people were things that had been at the heart of a British imperial common law. Once that logical issue was held up to the light by Lord Mansfield, and he famously said, "Let justice be done, though the heavens may fall," it was hard to recapture firm legal authority. And why is this so important? Why is it so important across the empire? It's because Mansfield and the other King's Bench judges who ruled on the case, that we usually never mention, there were in fact 4 judges involved, were the equivalent of the US Supreme Court today. And so it's actually like the Dobbs decision now. And I think I was saying to everyone right beforehand, it's not like Roe, which also had a policy impact in terms of opening up opportunities. This is a decision that, it is more like Roe, that opens up opportunities, and Dobbs is foreclosing them. So in a way, it has that kind of immediate impact that even if you're not a legal scholar, if you're just a person on the street in Texas or wherever, you're understanding immediately there's an impact to what Dobbs did. And it's that kind of significance. So it fundamentally shifted the conversation. And I would just say that it's also really important, and I mentioned the sort of parallel between Roe and Dobbs, that we understand that this is answering earlier decisions. And there's a kind of mythology that Britain and England before, as well as England's judges, hadn't played a crucial role in creating a legal principle that people could be things, especially if they were infidels and aliens. In fact, that word illegal alien has very long roots, or alien in the same, that sense and meaning. But the judges of the High Court in England had played this role a century before. Most importantly, a major King's Bench case called Butts versus Penny in 1677, that actually actively turned people into property, something that the Somerset case was overturning. So it's part of a long legal conversation in cases that had broad-ranging impact and caused a lot of conversation.
So if Holly's right, what I understand Holly to be saying is that there's a major myth about Anglo-American law that the Somerset case, paying attention to it, overturns, which is that slavery wasn't, that there weren't precedents, that there wasn't a law, that there's no there in terms of slavery in English law, that it had been contested and that there was a long history beforehand, and that has implications for how things turned out and for how we might think about that longer past. What are some of the other important myths or presumptions that we need to reconsider, or that the Somerset case helps us reconsider about this long history, which the way we've been talking about it seems 1772 may or may not be a hinge point, but it points us both backwards and forwards at least 100 years already in the conversation we're having.
Well, let me just say something about the impact on the American Revolution, which is a very contested point right now in public discourse in the United States. I think it's important to put the Somerset decision in the context of a larger ideological struggle that's going on between colonial leaders who feel that they are being marginalized within the British Empire, being treated as on the barbaric fringes and not entitled to the full rights of Englishmen, as they put it. They're in fact, they're carving out a position that in fact that they are the people who most care about liberty in the Anglo-American world, and that liberty is embattled within England and is finding a haven in the colonies. So the Somerset case works against that. And it works against the colonial claim, but it works to reiterate that there is a fundamental distinction in law and politics between the colonies and the mother country, and that the mother country is the vanguard of defending liberty. And the colonies are the barbaric fringes where a lot of things go that won't be allowed within the mother country, and therefore they don't deserve the full equality and rights of full participation in the British Empire. So the Somerset decision comes in the midst of this ongoing dispute in ideology between colonial leaders and the leaders of the British Empire. And so I think that's important to keep in mind.
Yeah, I would agree with Alan that this is that if we look at Somerset through the lens of the sort of traditional understanding of the conflict of laws and imperial governance, it opens up a really interesting way for us to talk about its impact and the impact of the politics of slavery and anti-slavery also on the revolution itself. I would pick up on the 2 points that were made by both Alan and Chris earlier about the notion of contestation. I think that's so important that African Americans kind of breathe life into and magnify this, and abolitionists do that too. They're not exactly building a myth. They're actually, it is a really savvy political tactic, right? You take a decision that really says that slaveholders can't willy-nilly come into England with their enslaved people and then forcibly take them back. Those slave grace later on sort of complicates that story too. That's another decision that comes later in the 19th century. But what they do, quite interestingly, is they magnify its importance. So not only are they the backdrop to this decision in terms of what I call the everyday political legal culture of Black people contesting slavery and trying to use every avenue to gain freedom, but they also run with the decision. So this notion that somehow it has no, the popular valorization of the decision, but somehow the traditional scholarly dismissal of it, of its significance. I think there is a mean, especially with the recent scholarship, to talk more about, I think, both the significance and how people try to breathe meaning into the decision in its aftermath. Here I really love Holly's work on this. Earlier on, George Wentleave had written about how there's a real attempt, or that there's some kind of a near slavery. Holly's wonderful article that was mentioned earlier shows how there's a real attempt to embed slavery into English law, the ideas of slavery and servitude, to embed it. And that Somerset then becomes a little more interesting in the ways it challenges that. So I think if we look at the idea of contestation that Alan mentioned, and look at it through the lens of the politics of slavery and empire, and also something that Chris mentioned about the pro-slavery backlash to this, that's exactly the contestation, right? And it reminds me a bit of the Haitian Revolution. Here are abolitionists and African Americans sort of valorizing it, but there's also concerted pro-slavery backlash to this moment with people like Edward Long in the West Indies. And I disagree with Matt Mason a little bit on this. I think there are people, slaveholders in the mainland North American colonies, who are also perturbed by Somerset. I think that gives us a sort of a lens into its broader significance, perhaps.
If I could just jump in on this point really quickly about the sort of cycles in scholarly understanding and interpretation, because we're come out of a moment where a number of historians, principally legal historians, but others, have really emphasized the limits of Mansfield's judgment, that it applies to England. It's concerned principally with habeas corpus, that it does not have, it's not meant to have implications for North America, the West Indies, and so on. It's worth knowing that that scholarship was reacting to a scholarship that came much earlier, that originated in the 19th century and went right down through World War II, right up until the 1970s, that used the Somerset case to tell a very patriotic story about Britain and the British Empire. That anti-slavery and emancipation originated in Britain, that there was something peculiar, specific about English law and English liberty, that the Somerset case at once confirmed and announced. And so the literature that we've been turning against was in part trying to puncture that notion that the Somerset case had these global ramifications because of Britain's global power. And so as we recover some of the broader implications and so the broader consequences of the Somerset, beyond the specific legal specifics of the decision, I think it's worth keeping in mind that other literature that is now largely forgotten and certainly not particularly emphasized in an American context. And just one more sort of thing on this point. There's been a lot of discussion, and I think comes partially out of the 1619 Project, about whether the Somerset case represents the beginning of an anti-slavery movement in Britain. And I think it's really important to think about anti-slavery in ways that are not anti-slavery, yes, it existed, or no, it did not. What's actually happening in this moment is a kind of a politics of identification and self-definition, where, as Alan suggested earlier, British men and women are increasingly defining themselves against their North American cousins. And the Somerset case provides a very useful way to sort of say, we're not like those people on the other side of the Atlantic who own slaves. That's not the same thing as being pro-emancipation or pro-slave trade abolition, or favoring, or even more, being sympathetic to the wants and needs of Black people in the empire. It's a certain kind of politics which is about distancing from slaveholders in the Americas to say something important about what British national character is like.
And this, I will say that in my view, that distancing changed over time. So that in the 17th century, colonists could not make laws or make court decisions that were repugnant to English law. In other words, court cases could be appealed up. So that it really mattered when you had high court cases that said people could be things, and that opened up a whole new trove of legal mechanisms that could be used to recover assets for debts, which turned out to be really important on the ground in places like Barbados and Virginia. But the problem was, in terms of the empire, questions of slavery, is that Somerset, in fact, was not the beginning of the High Court weighing in, even in an opposite way. So you had, after the Glorious Revolution and a whole new slate of judges after that revolution, a court case called Chamberlain versus Harvey in 1686 that said, no, people can't be things, that in fact Somerset is drawing on. And so you've got actually a century of contest, echoing Manisha's comments and Alan's, but into that stepped finally Parliament in the midst of shifting precedents over whether you could use this. There are actually two parliamentary laws, one in 1732, the Debt Recovery Act, and another in 1766, the Free Ports Act, both of which had clauses in them that said, essentially, in the empire, people could be assets for the recovery of debts if people were owned. So essentially, they're taking what had been a court decision and turning it into statutory law for the empire, which is part of why Mansfield was safe in saying this decision only applied in England itself, because this separation had happened between what was going on in the empire and what was going on in the colonies because of parliamentary acts. I mean, hidden clauses or relatively buried clauses, but really important ones in really important laws. And I will also say how remarkable, I absolutely recognize all of the importance and the courage of all those involved, including James Somerset, who was 31 at the time, roughly the age of Thomas Jefferson, to put things in comparative context here. But also the lawyer William Hargrave, who's just remarkable, and also Mansfield himself. I look at that case and the decisions that came before, and his willingness to do this and break with past precedent, which he said he deliberately did. And I think it must have something to do, as other scholars have pointed out. I think Stephen Wise, among others, I'm sure there are others who've done this, and the movie that David mentioned, that it probably has something to do with his great niece, Dido, who was herself partly African-American, and who lived with him in his house, and who he was apparently very close to, and who was about 8 years old at the time. So I think, in terms of thinking about his willingness as a, essentially a high court judge to break with precedent, that has something to do with it. And she has something.
It's fascinating that we're seeing the with renewed force and sophistication in Holly's argument for both the importance of judges and how amazing it is what Mansfield did. We're arguably seeing a revised version of the historiographical tradition that Chris is talking about, where the hero is Lord Mansfield, and even that he might have been, and so Dido then becomes a kind of parallel version of Somerset, making the whole thing happen. Which I'll just leaving that aside for a moment. I'm not sure I buy that, and we could talk more about it. There's not a lot of evidence, which is what makes it such a great subject for a movie. But I have floated, building on George Van Cleve and some others, and this gets back to the point Alan made about the imperial politics and the ideological arguments in the going on in 1772 around the colonial protest and the imperial response. That Mansfield had a compelling ideological interest. That's a phrase David Davis used more than once. A compelling ideological interest to decide the case in a way that made parliamentary sovereignty clear, And Mansfield was a firm believer in parliamentary sovereignty. He was a very strong Tory, and he was a member of the House of Lords, and he was very public about being against the colonial protests, and that people at the time understood this not just as a case about slavery, but they would have understood it's not just a subtext. It is saying that the law of slavery in England, well, yes, maybe the decision only applies to England, but it's very hard to put boundaries around the institution of slavery. And it also opens the possibility that Parliament, if not the courts, will then legislate slavery in the colonies. And he said that he said, well, really, Parliament should decide this, and I'm only making this decision in the absence of certain clarities in the law of slavery, so that the implications are not just that slavery might not be upheld in England, but that all manner of things might not in the empire might not be upheld in England,
Right.
either by the courts or by Parliament.
Right. And can I just add there that one tiny detail, it's fascinating to me that Edmund Burke actually wrote such a law that never passed in 1780. So,
And as Chris has made so clear, these are reforming laws that are being
Right.
proposed
Right.
to redevelop the law of slavery in the empire. That was a possibility. That it's one of the things that sometimes the seeming clarity of Mansfield's decision help us forget that there were all these alternatives.
Yeah. If I can jump in quickly, David, before we open up the floor, I just wanted to follow up on something that Chris said earlier about this sort of earlier Whiggish interpretation of the Somerset decision as, this sort of expansion of English liberty, I guess. And I think that's something that we really need to think about when we talk about the development of the law or notions about natural rights and human rights and freedom, is that people of African descent and people from empire and other, they're not just being acted upon. I mean, they're participating. There are nearly 15,000 people of African descent in Britain at that time. So they are making certain claims and they're part of this story. And I think that's what that earlier interpretation sort of completely ignored. And the reaction to it that maybe this actually even reinforced slavery in the colonies by proclaiming just Britain as exceptional. I think that has really been complicated by recent scholarship that, just the biographical information on Somerset and his, he seems to be a rather remarkable man. He's not just a name appended to this case. And also David Worrell, who actually put in a question about habeas corpus in the Q&A, his work on newspaper sources, that contestation that Alan was talking about, that, from January to June till the case is decided, the newspapers in England are debating this thoroughly. So Mansfield is kind of so the recent historical scholarship, I think, complicates that story so much more than, what we have always seen as the popular mythic valorization versus the scholarly skepticism. I think the recent historical research, including Holly's, that this contestation is taking place in England itself. It's not the king in parliament, it's the absolutist monarchy and people who have different ideas. So here's Mansfield, who's a Tory, but there's Sharp, who's completely sympathetic to the American cause. And just a shout out to Chris's brilliant chapter on Granville Sharp, actually, in his book, Moral Capital. I was trying to figure out Granville Sharp, and I just read Chris's book, that chapter, and I said, okay, now I think I get Granville Sharp.
It's so great.
Yeah.
One tiny, also, go ahead, just one bit of tiny trivia. For people like Thomas Jefferson, as they were studying the law, they were learning the earlier case law before Somerset to uphold the local court decisions that they were making in the colonies. So when Somerset literally invalidates Butts versus Penny, which we can talk about why, it upsets what all the lawyers in the colonies are learning as a precedent that they're supposed to be basing decisions on.
Great. And so I've returned and want to open up the floor now to all the questions that have come in. And we have a ton of great questions. And if people have questions, keep asking them. We're supposed to end at 2. I don't know if you all can stay on for maybe a few more minutes to try and get as many as we can. I doubt we'll be able to get them all. And in the sake of time, I'm going to try and combine questions as much as I can. So we have one from Jessica Georges, who asks, can the panelists share any examples or evidence of enslaved people being influenced or citing the case in their discussion. And to complement that, we have a question from Gabriel Lociano, who's asked, what are popular understandings of the Somerset case in the UK today? So one, can you all talk about how enslaved people knew, learned, or understood this case? And what is its status, would you say, today in the UK? Anyone want to raise their hands?
Well, I'll just say something. It's not directly from enslaved people responding to it, but it's an ad from the Virginia Gazette in 1773 for a master trying to recover an escaped slave, and he says that he thinks the enslaved person has gone off to England, and then he says, quote, where they imagine they will be free, a notion now prevalent among the Negroes, greatly to the vexation and prejudice of their masters.
Mhm.
So that's pretty direct evidence that enslaved people were talking about this decision.
Chris, I saw your hand.
I would second that. A lot of what I call fugitive slave abolitionists, right? They were enslaved, they become Black abolitionists. And what's interesting is that they actually directly quote Mansfield decision about how odious slavery is, or they will quote Hargraves, they will quote the lawyers for Somerset. There's an instance where Frederick Douglass does that clearly. He quotes it. So, Lincoln quotes Wilberforce more often, or refers to Wilberforce rather than Mansfield. But the fact is that it's not just the abolitionist lawyers and judges, that enslaved people are also making use of the precedent, and that they're using the term Somerset principle. And of course, Black abolitionists, white abolitionists in America do this constantly, referring to, how is it that monarchical Britain, this is after abolition, of course, British abolition, has gotten rid of slavery, and we in Republican America haven't, and the hypocrisy, etc. So there is that kind of discussion about it amongst enslaved people, from what I know of, just the cases being fought, in terms of also Black abolitionists specifically referring to it. And Douglas's is the one example I can think of immediately offhand.
I just wanted to briefly mention Thea Hunter's work, who found a lot of examples in Massachusetts in the years between 1773 and the 1783, when you have the successful Quack Walker and a couple other cases. There are clear examples she found right away of enslaved people in Massachusetts using the Somerset example to plead their own cases.
And it starts immediately in London. There's a celebration that's held with as many as 200 Africans, and the response is immediate. And there's a wonderful letter that's often quoted from an owner, an enslaver who knows about a slave who's run away, and he says to see his uncle Somerset. So the owning class in Britain already, they certainly think that all the Africans know about it and are acting upon it, and are saying that it did more than it may have actually done.
I have another question, Chris. This might be a good one for you. I know you're trying to get in on the last question too. But the first one's from Julieta Rodriguez, who was asking about where Somerset was located, UK, the colonies, America. And we also just got a question from J.L. Bell, who has found an advertisement in the 1771 Massachusetts newspaper in which it describes an escaped enslaved man trying to get on a vessel to go to England. And this is a quote, under the notion, if he could get there, he should be free. So could you talk a little bit about slavery in England itself and notions of slavery and freedom within the British Empire writ large?
Yeah, well, big subject. I'll just say
I only got like 2 minutes. So.
Somerset effects are all across the English-speaking world and within Black communities. I mean, we've just heard a number of of instances that David has cited, Manisha cited, Alan's cited. I mean, there are lots and lots of cases in which we have these fugitive references of enslaved men and women, or enslaved men and women who have run away, invoking the Somerset case. It should also be said that like one very specific impact that's clear on the law is in Scotland, where Joseph Knight, brings a case before the Scottish courts that leads to the formal abolition of slavery in Scotland, which is different from what happens in England, right? It's actually just outlawed in Scotland in the courts. And that's inspired directly by the Somerset case. This case is 1777, 1778. So there's a kind of there's a way, as Manisha is saying, and it's absolutely right, that men and women of African descent in the British Empire are putting pressure on laws, putting pressure on courts, putting pressure on institutions to try to capitalize on the leverage that the Somerset case seems to provide, even if the judgment itself, go way beyond the terms of the law. And it's really important for understanding some of the politics of both the American Revolution and afterwards, as Alan has documented for the War of 1812. Where you have Black men and women looking to the British government, looking to the British Empire as leverage for achieving their own liberty, not because they're Anglophiles, not because they're loyalists, but because they see the crown as a potential counterweight to American slaveholders. One last thing I'll just say about the sort of contemporary resonance in Britain. I don't know that there were any events at all in Britain in this year, this 250th anniversary of the Somerset case, and I think that that's quite telling. Or maybe they were, they didn't tell me about it, which no problem there. But I think the case has been discussed more extensively of late in the United States than it has been in Britain itself, or even in England, where the case was in fact decided, and that might be worth thinking about.
Great, thanks. So I've got two more questions. The first one sounds like a factual question, but I think it's a lot bigger than that. And that's coming from Clyde Spillinger. And he says, the best known rendering of Mansfield's opinion says, and this is a quote, "The state of slavery is so odious that nothing can be suffered to support it but positive law." And what he wants to know is, does the phrase state of slavery refer to the institution of slavery or the fact of an individual being a slave? And related to that, we had a question from David Worrell, who wanted to know if anybody knows when the first time a habeas corpus case was brought in the United States for an enslaved person. So I think those are kind of related questions, if anybody can take one or both of them.
So I'm not sure if they were habeas corpus cases, but I think that would have been the normal writ. There were a bunch of cases that Jefferson was involved in the 1760s that David Koenig has worked on that actually weren't as universal as Somerset. They were just about ancestry. So Native Americans were not allowed to, Indians were not allowed to be enslaved under Virginia law. And so he was involved in cases arguing for freedom for the descendants of Native Americans. A mother in their ancestry had been. So I think those were habeas corpus cases, actually, if I had to. So I think it was, in other words, the normal writ that one would use. There was a couple other possibilities, but they're much more obscure. So and I agree. I don't know if anybody else, but the question of the state of slavery would refer to the condition of to the condition of slavery. Sorry, I don't know what's going on with my computer.
See everybody nodding their heads in agreement. So that's great. Thank you. Here's a great question from Peter Fay. And he really kind of calls us all out here, where he says this was pitched as a debate over whether or not there is the significance or insignificance of Somerset. And everybody on this panel has said that it was significant and had an impact on the American Revolution. But they also acknowledge that there are people who say the other side. So he'd like one or all of you to marshal the arguments of those who would argue for Somerset's insignificance.
Well, I'm familiar with it, and I'm sure the other panelists are as well. And so the argument that somebody like Gordon Wood would make, and has made, is that the American Revolution is something that we primarily find in the state papers and correspondence of those people who led the revolution in a political and military sense. And that when you look at that body of literature, that you don't find them commenting overtly about the Somerset case any kind of frequency, and that they are putting forward other issues that they are claiming is what causes the American Revolution. So I would say that that's the argument on that side of the question. And a lot of it has to do with where do you find the founders of the American Revolution, the movers of the American Revolution? Is it, do we look at this, these top leaders in politics and the military, or do we broaden that out to see many more makers of the revolution?
Actually, I would add to that, even in a legal sense, Somerset did not have an immediate impact on anywhere in the empire because these parliamentary laws secured it. And even after the revolution, it said that people were assets, collateral for debts. They were things, and these mechanisms could be used to recover them. And even after the American Revolution, one of the crucial parts of the Treaty of Paris that ended the revolution in Article 4 made it so that colonists had to repay all debts owed from before the revolution, for which enslaved people had been in collateral. So it essentially gave a huge push to make sure the pre-existing norms, even despite the repeal, obviously the non-application of parliamentary laws, would be enforced. And so what you had going on in both in the Caribbean, but especially in North America, is new arguments coming from judges about how it had been only their own precedents which had turned people into property, not those of the empire. So what you actually have is mostly immovability in most places, even after Somerset, even if Somerset sparked larger conversations about whether slavery generally could be justified.
So if I could jump in here a little bit, Patrick, I think there was this notion, the contrary argument, that somehow by making this very sort of minimalist, narrow decision, Mansfield actually reinforced colonial slavery, because there it was established through slave codes, through positive law, that it creating this sort of exceptional English model. And I think Edmund Morgan in his book tried to transport that argument to Virginia, while Balin had this notion of contagion of liberty. I mean, I think there's a mean there that we should be thinking about, to think of these contestations occurring in Britain, in the colonies, amongst different groups in different sections, colonies, M.I. Finlay's old demarcation, right? Slave society of slaves that Ira Berlin used for northern and southern colonies. But in all the 13 colonies, if you were a slaveholder, you were not too happy with Somerset, even though it was a narrow decision that challenged your prerogative to travel to Britain, which may have been an important thing for them too. So, there is that contrary argument, but I don't think it holds that much water, that it actually reinforced colonial slavery, especially if you look at what Chris alluded to, which is the pro-slavery response that Sri Vidya Swaminathan has talked about in the context of the West Indies, or if you look at slaveholders in the US. Now, whether this notion that the American Revolution was a pro-slavery or an abolitionist, I think that's kind of an anachronistic question. I think different groups and different regions saw it differently. The Civil War, you can say, was definitely a war that had sides that were pro and anti-slavery. And it's precisely because these groups had differing memories and differing understandings of the relationship of slavery and the revolutionary project itself that you end up in that situation. So I really think the Somerset case on the whole, just looking at the longue durée, looking at its afterlives in 19th century United States, the notion that somehow it reinforced colonial slavery, I'm not and looking at the reaction of slaveholders, I'm not sure I'd buy that argument, though that's exactly what the interpretation was, I think, for some time.
Chris, what do you think?
You're muted, Chris.
I'm muted because I've got loud New York City traffic outside my window. There's just so much to say about this. I mean, I do think that I really like the point that Manisha made just a few moments ago about the question of whether the American Revolution was pro-slavery or anti-slavery is in fact an anachronistic question. It's more our question than a question that was sort of asked at the time. As you could find defenders of slavery and critics of it on both sides, both patriot and loyalist. The thing that's always mattered to me is that the Somerset case has this effect of, it's one of the vehicles by which the issue of slavery gets politicized. It becomes a political question in the 1770s, in part because of the Somerset case, in part because of a number of other conflicts associated with the American independence movement, in ways that it just simply hadn't been before. I think it can be hard to get our heads around the ways that for over 100 years, among elites, the question of slavery just was not much of a question. They just didn't debate it that often. And it's only in this period that there develops a kind of a really significant debate among people who are free and wealthy about about the institution's legitimacy, its justice, its morality. And so I think the Somerset case is central to that story.
Great, thanks. So I think I have time for two more, but David, I wanted to ask you to have a chance to sound off on this issue as well.
Oh, I'm afraid if I get started on that, I'll take too long. So I'll just pick one issue among many. I agree with everything that's been said before, and I just add that one of the problems with measuring the importance of Somerset by whether the founding fathers talked about it in their papers and in their public statements or their private ones that Alan has alluded to, and which is usually the measure for Gordon Wood and other leading historians who use a capital F when talking about the founding, is that they talked about things that it was in their interest to talk about and that would achieve something politically. What to say about the Somerset case, given the way it had been set up and made Britain look good and embarrassed the Americans, what would they have said about it? Even Benjamin Franklin, who's in England and representing several of the colonies, he writes an anonymous newspaper piece in which he goes with the flow and says, this is a great thing for liberty, but it shows that it shows that England is pharisaical and completely hypocritical because they freed one slave, but look, they're responsible for the entire slave trade. So he's trying to spin it to make the Americans look like, well, we're not the bad guys. You foisted the slave trade on us, anticipating Jefferson's draft of the Declaration of Independence. That has been used to say, oh, look how anti-slavery Franklin was, taking it out of its context. But actually what it shows is that Franklin is quite aware that of this dynamic that Chris has just pointed to, that the Somerset case has further politicized slavery. It has mixed it up with the imperial politics in ways that are going to be very difficult to entangle, and it is going to have both anti-slavery and pro-slavery effects. So that what I'm hoping will come out of this is that we're at a point where we realize that we can't talk about the politics of the American Revolution without talking about the politics of slavery, and we can't talk about the politics of slavery without talking about the nature and effects of the imperial controversy, the revolution, or the Civil War in the British Empire.
Thank you, David. Just one last question. We received 33 questions from the audience, 33 questions, which is just fantastic, and shows you how interested and engaged people are with this topic. Obviously, we haven't been able to get to nearly any of them. Last question I'm going to ask comes from about Marianne Lane, who asked, after the decision, were people of color permitted to learn to read to write? Or I think what she's getting at is what maybe changed after this decision, if anything. And Harold Klein's direct question is, what was the effect of Somerset on the enslaved people in England? So after this decision was made the next day, the next month, we've been talking big picture, but just in the practical way of everyday life, what changed, if anything, for the enslaved in England?
The immediate impact was that in the courtroom, when Mansfield rendered his decision, contemporary reports indicate that there were dozens and dozens and dozens of men and women of African descent who celebrated the decision and continued to celebrate it for weeks afterwards. This was a very big moment for the Black community in London because it seemed to establish real limits on the powers of slaveholders living in England. And it immediately led to what essentially are kinds of negotiations around, you can't hold me as a slave anymore. I can run away and you cannot force me to return. So therefore, we need to talk about the terms under which I work for you and the terms under which I'm going to be, compensated for my work. So, we don't have access to these kinds of everyday negotiations, but this is why I was using the term leverage earlier. There's also a kind of leverage that happens in interpersonal relations, where in a situation where there is no slave law that will prevent someone from running away and make it possible to retrieve them, then people who claim property rights over someone also need to find ways to keep them on board that don't involve sending them out of the country. And that's not necessarily about, promoting their social welfare. It doesn't necessarily lead to an increased number of baptisms or, an attempt to improve the lives of people of African descent, but it gives them so many more choices in dealing with the people who have power over them. And that's something, again, something very difficult to measure and document, but the few documents that we do have, that impact is very, very clear.
Right. So,
sorry,
go ahead.
I would just second that and say that this is, in terms of the impact for people of African descent, who are, caught between between slavery, freedom, between these different conflicts of laws and this sort of imperial setup, is that what it does is, I think, fundamentally for Black freedom claims to be heard, both in court and in a popular sense. There's a really interesting article by Lige Gould that talks about like zones of law and zones of violence. And when we think about indigenous dispossession, empire, the slave trade and slavery, these were zones of brutality and violence that the British maintained and created these zones of laws, the rights of Englishmen, for themselves. What I think Somerset does is kind of makes Black freedom claims enter those zones of law and insist that, those protections, those rights are applicable to us, as Olaudah Equiano would put it, as subjects of the empire, but as, Black people in Massachusetts would put it, as citizens of the new republic. So, I think that is the broader impact, the broader ideological impact, as David Bryan Davis would probably put it, that I think creates a problem of slavery for empires like Britain, but also for the slaveholding republic.
And if I could add just a few words here about the longer picture, because it's so important to remember that exclusion of Blacks was not automatic. So there's a wonderful book by a guy named Imtiaz Habib about Black lives in the English archives. And he showed how up till 1677 and this first big court case, you see Black people in the records in all kinds of ways, but not described as slaves and not, being able to do all kinds of things. And then there's a big shift after 1677. And likewise, I think you can see a similar shift. And as Chris Manisha were just pointing to, after 1772 in England itself. So these decisions have really important effects in first excluding and then including potentially in terms of particular access to rights and lawsuits. Important for so many people's lives.
Thanks. Last question is one that I'm going to just reserve for myself, which is to wrap things up. We had about 180 people zooming in during this Zoom. And if one of them's having dinner tonight with a friend and they mentioned they, attended this roundtable about the Somerset case, what's the one thing you'd like them to convey to their friend about what they heard today or about the case itself that maybe hasn't been shared already? And maybe I'll start in my tile of screens, Alan first, and then Manisha, Chris, Holly, and David.
This is probably the toughest question asked of all. What's the one thing? We've just been listening to all these riches and the complexity and nuances and power of this decision. So I guess that would be my takeaway. This is an immensely rich decision on its own terms. And then when we see how people will use this, people of color in particular, but anybody who's a critic of slavery, and also people who want to support slavery will pick up on this, that this has enduring power and importance that will grow over time, which is a point that the other panelists have made very nicely today.
Great. Thanks, Manisha.
Yeah, so yeah, that is a tough question. If I was talking about Somerset at a dinner party and assuming no one was a historian there, but that they are, really conversant with what's happening today in terms of the rise of global authoritarianism and threats to things that we take for granted, rule of law, democratic norms, democratic governance. I would say that this story is an old one, and you could go right back to Somerset and see people contesting, slavery, empire, and rights, and and claims that maybe we should understand that these things don't just like progress on their own or are some part of some bigger story of Western freedom. Because they aren't, and perhaps as citizens today, we should be inspired by people like Somerset to, as ordinary citizens, stake our claim and make our sort of contributions to this ongoing project, which is always contested, which will always be opposed. We don't have slaveholders today, but we have a lot of people today who don't believe, who have very parochial notions of rights and liberties, and so. Yeah, that's what I would say.
Thank you. Chris?
I would just say that the Somerset case marks the moment when the politics of slavery in a modern sense begin. I really think that it's the start of the controversies that conclude in the English-speaking world with the Civil War in the United States, and then continue on around the rights that people of African descent have in law, and the extent to which they can or cannot be treated differently from other citizens or other subjects. I really think that the Somerset case inaugurates a new moment in those discussions that really runs down to the end of the 19th century. So it really matters, even if the case itself, even if the judgment itself had somewhat narrow terms.
Great.
So,
Thank you, Holly.
I would agree that it inaugurates a new moment, but I would say those conversations are much more explicit than we've acknowledged going back for 2 centuries. And that my takeaway would be that ideas matter, especially as they're embodied in law. And I'm going to read to you just a really quick quote from the Barbados agent in London in 1773, who was responding to that Somerset case. And just this one quick paragraph, he says, although this argument of Mr. Hargrave is one of Somerset's lawyers, is said to have been delivered in the particular case of Somerset, a Negro, yet it is meant and intended as a course of reasoning upon the general question of the state and condition of Negroes. So you can see there that it's opening up this really big question about who has what status, who has what rights, and how and whether Black African American Afro-Britons can be excluded. But ideas matter.
Great. Thanks, David.
I'll go with Manisha's point. Fugitive Africans made British and American history, and I guess a meld of Chris and Alan's points made earlier, which is that slavery was controversial before 1776. So maybe you can't give the American Revolution all the credit for anti-slavery in some kind of direct way, but it was already there, and it shaped the American Revolution.
Right. Well, thank you all. I also want to share that there are several questions about new directions for scholarship, whether or not any of you are working on a project that is going to be a biography of the case or the individuals involved, which I think just reflects the real interest and excitement that you all have generated with our audience. So I thank you again for your time, and I want to thank everybody for zooming in. Please check out the rest of the APS's offerings on our website, and I hope to see you all in person or on Zoom in the near future. Thank you again.